A very good morning to you, and thank you so much for watching and having us on. Welcome to the Authentic Resilience Report for 2021. My name is Sia Sangweni, and thank you so much for having me here, let me say. I have the honor and privilege of being your master of ceremonies this morning. Welcome to a RedZone and Arena events in collaboration with BrandMapp and the Resilience Factory event. So this morning on 11:11, and hey, it's actually 11 a.m. right now, we'll be looking at authentic resilience. What is it and why do we need it? I'm sure, just like me, you're gearing up and ready to learn more about this topic. It's a first ever in-depth study. So very, very much looking forward to what we'll be learning and unpacking this morning. Now, for some context, the Authentic Resilience Report is a collaboration between the Resilience Factory and leading research company Y5 Insights. So we'll be looking at the national survey that is based on the Resilience Factory's 10 R's of authentic resilience. So these measures have produced very fascinating insights, if I do say so myself, into specific resilient behavior, which in turn allows for a resilience index rating, which we can view by demographic segments like age, gender, education, and income. So everyone say it with me, clearly the word of the day is resilience, yes. So this will all be presented by a very stellar lineup this morning, starting with Dr. John Wentzel, who's the CEO of Adcorp Group in Africa and Australia. We'll also be hearing from Brendan de Kock, who is the Director of Storytelling at BrandMapp, and then also Gabi Lowe, who is the Director at the Resilience Factory. And then we'll also be hearing from Pippa, who's also a Director at the Resilience Factory. So lots to get into this morning. We hope you'll be enjoying the conversation. Please do engage with us. You can send us your questions and comments during the live chat. But without any further ado, let's kick things off with you, Dr. Wentzel. Please shed some light on why everyone is talking about resilience.
Good morning, Sia, and thank you for that introduction. As Group CEO of Adcorp, this is an important topic for us. And maybe just talk a little bit about Adcorp. We are a workforce solutions business. We provide workforces to our clients. We have in excess of 40,000 employees, assignees, and contractors, and we deploy them to hundreds of clients across hundreds of sites, and that pretty much covers every sector. And what we've sort of seen anecdotally over the last 18 months in conjunction with the pandemic, if you like, there are two areas that we have seen. One can call work-related stresses. So what we've seen over the last 18 months in our clients and ourselves, we've seen large-scale redundancies as organizations have had to cut back on staff as a consequence of the pandemic. We've seen people having to forego increases, people having to make salary sacrifices, and we've also seen people having fears that the business that they were employed in would go under. Stats SA reported just recently that in the first half of 2021, more than 1,000 businesses were liquidated. And in the whole of 2020, in excess of 2,000 businesses were liquidated. And these liquidations tend to affect lower level jobs and entry level jobs, and they appear to be the hardest hit. And the service industry in particular has also been hardest hit. And these stresses seem to disproportionately affect younger people, people with less experience, people with lower levels of education. So those are sort of all the work-related stresses we've seen over the last 18 months. We've also seen what I would call societal stresses. We know, for example, in South Africa, we have high unemployment, the highest unemployment rate in the world, 34.4%. But the unemployment also disproportionately affects young people. And if you use the expanded definition of unemployment, then youth unemployment, people 25 and younger, the unemployment rate is 74.8%. And in the broader society in South Africa, tragically, we saw the violence in KwaZulu-Natal in July. We know that a lot of people are fearful of crime and violence. We've seen load shedding. That's putting stress into people's everyday lives. Many of us know and have experienced individuals who've been lost or become ill as a consequence of COVID. I think everyone knows at least one person. So, what we are seeing over the last 18 months is that people are under more pressure and stress than we've seen in a long time. In the workspace, people are being asked to do more with less. Working from home means you never leave work. And people are anxious about holding on to their jobs. or never getting one. And people are despondent. And what we've seen anecdotally is that more so younger people than older people. So as a workforce solutions company, what are we concerned about? Well, we are concerned about that after the COVID pandemic comes the second pandemic, and that's the mental health pandemic. We know that the COVID pandemic will be with us forever. But in corporate South Africa, I don't think we are fully geared up to cope with the situation. South Africa also has a tough culture. We're tough people. We don't talk about our problems. But we are fearful of that unless we start dealing with this issue of the stresses people are under and the pressures that they face, that we're going to wind up with severe productivity and potential loss in this generation. We've seen in Europe and the United States something called the Great Resignation, and we see aspects of that coming to South Africa. And this is where people just quit their jobs because they can't cope anymore. So we are seeing higher levels of resignation where people do not have another job, but they just resign because they can't cope anymore. So we think it's important for a couple of reasons to talk about this. We know that we will never get back to the world in September 2019. At the same time, we know looking forward, the majority of the workforce into the future will be Generation Y and Generation Z. And if we don't start talking about coping mechanisms and enabling resilience and understanding resilience, then our fear and why we think it's important is that this second pandemic, this mental health pandemic, the cost of the second pandemic will be a multiple of the first pandemic.
Thanks for that insight, Dr. Wentzel. There's a lot going on here that we need to be looking at and unpacking. So from a authentic resilience perspective, I want to bring in Gabi and Pippa on this one. From what you guys have seen at the Resilience Factory, what can you add to what Dr. Wentzel was saying?
Well, absolutely. Thank you for that, Dr. Wentzel. It's very true. So Pippa and I have been working with the topic of resilience for about 6 years. And initially, yes, there was interest, but not nearly as much interest as there has been recently, of course, because things have been ratcheted up by the pandemic. So what's coming through so much in our practices and in the Resilience Factory business is people are really battling with turbulence, uncertainty, and that constant unpredictability on a daily basis is putting people in a very difficult situation and heightened anxiety. Violence and fear, ongoing financial pressure, everything that Dr. Wentzel was talking about, economic uncertainty, business closures and liquidations, job losses and salary sacrifices are putting additional stress and pressure onto the individual. Illness, long COVID, family disconnection. I mean, that has been huge. Disconnect within businesses, disconnect within families. A sense of isolation is really ratcheting up those mental health issues. So we are seeing a huge increase in ongoing heightened levels of anxiety, not being able to cope. And then, of course, there is grief and loss on a massive scale, on a much, much grander scale than normal. Never mind the smaller things like school closures and working parents trying to cope with children who are working from home.
And let's not forget, in the midst of all of this chaos that we've been facing, people have still had their normal problems to face, marital issues, dealing with aging parents, teenage crises and more. The normal stuff that used to get our attention kind of barely gets a look in any longer because we're so focused on the pandemic and everything that's brought with it. And as coaches, Gabi and I have been seeing massively increased levels of anxiety and overwhelm in our practices. And really, it's across all age groups and business sectors. And this is precisely why everybody is talking about this real need for resilience even more than ever. So as Gabi said, at the Resilience Factor, we've been looking at studying and really working how we can teach the tools of resilience for the last 6 years or so. And it just feels like in the last 18, 20 months, the whole world has caught up with us. So we just want to say welcome to the world of resilience, our world of resilience.
Absolutely. So our world of resilience is not about resilience, it's about authentic resilience, as you will have noticed. And what on earth do we mean by that? And we're going to unpack exactly that in a few minutes. But just to share with you our definition of authentic resilience, where it's very different to what you'll find if you Google resilience. So this is our definition at the Resilience Factory. Authentic resilience is a critical life skill. It is the powerful ability to survive, thrive, and grow in the face of stress, change, adversity, and yes, even trauma. And the good news, everyone has the capacity to develop much greater levels of authentic resilience. So I think what we'll do is we're going to go through a few myths of resilience, which is going to help to unpack for you what resilience is not.
Yeah, so that's what resilience is. So here is what it is not, because there is so much which is out there in the world about what resilience is that we think is both potentially misleading and it can actually be damaging as well. We're going to unpack those myths for you right now. They're going to give you just the 5 most common myths that we have found.
Absolutely. So we have, when we do our course, we have 10 myths that we unpack, but we'll just do 5 with you this morning. Right. So if you went right now and you Googled resilience, what you would find everywhere is bouncing back. This is a myth. So what we know is that anybody who has experienced real trauma, severe loss, or adversity will tell you that there's simply no bouncing. You don't bounce from severe calamity, and nor would you want to, because we know that working through trauma, real trauma, takes intentional time, it takes effort, and it takes real attention and work and processing. So if you were to bounce from that kind of trauma and loss, we know that you've done none of the processing that you really need to do in order to heal and to grow and to really become a lot more robust. So there really is no bouncing. Also, the back part. You don't go back. When you've experienced difficulty, you don't go back. And maybe that feels like an additional loss, but it's not really, because everything goes into the pot of making up who we are, right? But what we know is you can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unexperience what you've experienced as much as you might want to. And you certainly can't go back to who you were before you went through this experience. So the work of authentic resilience is about integrating. That's what you can do. You can integrate all of your experiences into who you are, assimilate it, work it through, and make sense of the pain, the suffering, and the loss, so that you can find a way to give it meaning and to grow forward.
The second myth about resilience is it's all about being tough and strong. And words like hardy and forceful and robust and being persistent to the extreme, a bit like going out into battle with an impenetrable suit of armor on to protect you from the world. Now, this might work for a while, this idea of putting on a suit of armor, but it doesn't work for long, because authentic resilience, the kind that lasts a lifetime, comes as a core capacity from deep within us. And it's a capacity that you develop and you nurture and you build during those challenging times deep inside of you. And paradoxically, the most authentically resilient people are in fact the ones who've got the courage to be vulnerable, to fail, to forgive, all characteristics that are often thought of as being weaknesses. So when we resist rigidity, which is the more defensive, tough and strong position, and we learn to embrace flexibility and uncertainty and embrace our vulnerability, that is when we really learn to develop long-term, sustained, authentic resilience that will get us through even the toughest of life circumstances. So whilst resilient people might not appear to dwell on their emotions, authentically resilient people are able to fully engage with a wide range of emotions, both their own and those of other people as well, even the tougher and more challenging emotions. And we never talk about positive or negative emotions, because emotions are simply that. They are just emotions. We give the value to them. But if we allow ourselves and have the courage to face all of our emotions, to sit with them, to talk about them, to process them, we learn that they do not have the power to destroy us. Running from them, however, might just do that.
Exactly. And It's such an interesting thing because it's something that people really resist. And we understand that the psyche likes to avoid pain. But you'll see in the research that this has been proven to be a really important part of authentic resilience. So myth number three talks about the fact that resilience is just about putting your head down and getting on with it. And I mean, how many times have you heard someone say that? I've heard people say that to a depressed person. Oh, just get on with it. Depression doesn't equal just get on with it. It doesn't work like that. So yes, we know and understand there are undoubtedly moments when there's no choice but to just keep going, even when you really don't feel like it. But to rely on that kind of grit and willpower alone for an extended ongoing period of time is not an authentically resilient solution. So we can't run marathon after marathon after marathon after marathon without stopping at the watering hole. You have to stop at the watering hole. You're going to collapse at some stage if you don't, because we are human. So in order to take our humanness into account, what's become very clear in our authentic resilience work is that the most resilient of people are just that, because they know when to stop, when to refuel, when to renew and to restore, and how to care for themselves along the way. Authentically resilient people understand the importance of really looking after themselves. And they don't think it should be, even when they don't think it should be a priority. And that's the problem, is very often when we're in a crisis, what we need falls off the table. But authentically resilient people realize you've got to take care of it at the same time, regardless of the fact that you're in crisis, right? Otherwise, you're not going to be able to go the long distance. We've seen that with people during the pandemic. In the beginning, they were like, I'm just going to put my head down and get on with it. And now they were, really? It's still here? Yes. So the authentically resilient way is to know your needs, know what they are, and ensure you are taking care of those needs, all of them, physical, emotional, mental, especially during those times of difficulty, even when you least feel like it.
The fourth myth about resilience, I'm just going to go back and talk about, our slides are slightly out of order here. So resilient people are just born that way. We just skipped over one there. So contrary to what many people think, resilience isn't a superpower that you're just born with, that you've either got it or you haven't. And it's true that as a species, we are undoubtedly resilient, because otherwise we wouldn't have survived. But resilience isn't a character strength that you either have or don't have. And I think that that is really, really great news. Because the fact is, we're all born with a level of resilience which can increase and become greater. And even more so when there's a really conscious decision to grow and practice our resiliency. So that is the really great news. I think that if you think that we're just born with it or we haven't got it, then it's going to be pretty hopeless for a lot of it. The fact is, whatever your resilience levels are right now, you can grow them and increase them.
Absolutely. Won't you put up myth number 5 for us there, Brandon? Because, that we only need resilience during times of trauma. We've spoken about that. The other, which one did I skip over?
Going it alone.
Going it alone. Okay, so this is another myth, that resilient people can go it alone. And it's very tempting to think, oh, well, I know someone who's really resilient. They don't appear to need anybody else. Maybe they don't appear to need anyone else, but the truth is, we are social beings. We are wired for connection, and we're not actually intended to go and do it alone. And to try and do this journey of life, especially when things get tough and difficult, alone is going to make it that much harder for you. So it simply means that you are disconnected, isolated, and not actually plugged into what you need. It's not healthy, and it's not sustainable in the long term. So authentically resilient people understand and know that we are stronger together. Yes, it's a cliche for a reason. We need to aim for interdependence within our society, within our communities, within our families, within our teams at work. Interdependence is exactly what we need, especially during the toughest of times. That's when we need it the most. So, now that we know some of the things that resilience is not. And we also know that when we go out there and we look for resilience, we find the opposite to what we've described. This was a bit alarming. So what did we do with that, Pippa?
Yeah. So we were actually quite dismayed about what was out there about resilience and available to the public on the topic of resilience. So we decided to develop a much needed roadmap for those needing greater levels of resilience. This is a grounded theory model based on our own experiences, as well as those of others, combined with all the reading and the research that we've done around the topic and underpinned by the theories such as positive psychology, logotherapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and more. Brandon, I wonder if you can just go on to the next slide for us. Thanks.
Okay. So what we came up with, because both Pippa and I have had our own series of traumas in our life, and we constantly been asked, well, how do you cope, right? So we started to do that work. How do we cope? How did we cope? How do we continue to get through? And as Pippa said, came up with this grounded theory model. The 10 R's model is taught in many different ways. It's taught as a full day workshop. It's taught as a full in-depth online course that takes up to 12 months. They're 12 modules. So it is quite in-depth, but for today's purpose, we're literally going to give you a top-level look at the subject matter of each of the 10 R's. So we'll go into the 10 R's. It is a roadmap. It goes in order. The first 5 R's, 1 to 5, are your crisis kit, and the second 5 R's are the bedrock, the undersling that keep giving you this intentional, authentic resilience that you can build sort of a bank account so that when you need it, it is there for you. So we'll go through them one at a time and literally just giving you the names of the modules. So the very first R is reality. You can't get out of the starting blocks if you're not staring down the brutal truth, the facts, the real facts. So this is about facing the facts of your current reality, no matter what that is, no matter how tough that is, head on. And this is about finding a place in the middle called realistic optimism. So it's not about drama. It's not about going into story and catastrophizing and making it more dramatic than it is. But it's also not about denial and making assumptions. It's about staying in the place of realistic optimism. That's the first R.
The second R is what we call reach in, and this is about facing and embracing your fears, your feelings, and your vulnerabilities. And this can seem quite strange because very often once we face reality, the very next thing we want to do is to skip straight over this and go straight into action. But the fact is, and this is what the research has borne out, which is fantastic news, is that the most authentically resilient people have got the courage to stop and to actually embrace all their fears and their feelings and actually really become emotionally mature and integrated. So it's not about denying the emotions. It's not about trying to sweep them away and push them out. It's not about becoming overwhelmed by the emotions, but it's about having the courage to really go through those emotions and really deal with that capacity and develop our emotional intelligence.
Moving from bracing against to embracing. The third R is about responsibility. And this is all about emotional intelligence and our ability to respond. No, we don't get to choose the events that happen. Things happen that we have no control over. But what we do have is we always have the power to have choice as to how we respond. So instead of just knee-jerk reacting, responding and understanding that responsibility for our own emotional well-being lies with us.
Our number 4 is what we call reach out, and it's about the ability to effectively give and receive and ask for and seek support. So this is all about the power of communication. It's about building a network of support for yourself. And again, borne out by the data, how important it is that support is two-way, that both you are able to ask for support from other people and you're able to receive support from other people as well, that you're not afraid to do that.
And the first one is R number 2 and R number 4 are very often the ones that make people feel vulnerable, but they are the ones that make the biggest difference. And we will see that in the research. R number 5 is about robust revolutionary thinking. Well, clearly, when we're in crisis, we need some different thinking. We know that. But when we are in crisis, the interesting thing is that very often that ability shuts down. So authentically resilient people know how to access their creative thinking skills, even during times of stress. And we teach all sorts of tools of how to do this. How can you access this when in fact you're feeling like shutting down?
So those are the first 5 R's. Those are what we call the crisis kit. The second 5 R's are very much about building a resilience bank account. So no matter what comes your way, you are prepared to deal with whatever it faces. And if there's one thing that we know for sure, for certain, is that change is the only constant, and the relentlessness of change is our number 6. And it's learning to work with and accept change, which is really the only constant in life. So it's all about the ability to be flexible and adaptable, and paradoxically, the need for grit and perseverance to keep on keeping on no matter what is happening.
Our number 7 is about reflection. One's instant response, reflection, what on earth has that got to do with resilience? An awful lot, as you will see from the research. This is about becoming a human being, not just a human doing. And when we are constantly busy, we don't build the capacity that we need for reflective observation, looking back and learning from events that have happened in our life, and finding a way to fill up from the inside, to know that we can always rely on ourselves as a resource for refueling and renewing. And that all stems from time spent alone in reflection.
Our number 8 is about renewal, and it's the value of self-care and stopping to refuel regularly, because what we know, again, is the fact that the most resilient people are the ones who don't just try and push on relentlessly, but they're the ones who know that in order to keep running the journey of life, they need to take care of themselves, or they're not able to take care of other people's needs. They're not able to be there in the long term. So this is all about self-care practices, about self-compassion, and about looking at possibly how we might numb ourselves along the way as well.
Then ratio. What on earth does that mean? That means that no matter what you've been through, ratio is the ability to hold your own suffering on the one hand, yes, but to hold up against that everything else that life has to offer. Yes, it's brutal and it's beautiful. So this is about living life with perspective, being able to step back, have a much broader picture, seeking out and tracking down purpose and meaning, hope, humor, all of those beautiful things that make life worth living no matter what.
And finally, number 10 is about recalibration. And this is about really learning to reframe whatever it is that's happened to us in our life. Whatever is happening is about, yes, the reality of what it is, but how can we reframe that? And also, how can we use adversity as a platform for growth? And to be one of approximately 50% of people who go through severe adversity and come out of it going through something that which is known as post-traumatic growth. Fascinating subject. So this is the model. This is a very brief look at the model, which we say we teach in great depth over many, many modules. But the fact is that having taught this to thousands of people around the world, either in person or online, we were really good and happy with this model that we've developed. And yet what we were so excited to do is to really validate and quantify our findings on a much, much larger scale. And so we approached BrandMapp to do that for us, to say, is it possible to quantify and validate our theory of authentic resilience?
Great question there. Thank you very much for your insights and those 10 R's. I'll definitely be applying that in my life. And thanks for the welcome, Gabi and Pippa, by the way, the welcome to the Resilience Club. Even though we've all been stressing way too much, it's clear we're late to that party. It's very eye-opening, and it's also very reaffirming, I'd have to say. This feels like the therapy session that we've all been needing to have, ladies. Just a reminder to you watching, please do send us your questions and your comments if you have any. Our presenters would be surely keen to answer any of those, so you can send those through using the live chat. I want to bring in Brendan de Kock now from BrandMapp. What have you found on this, as the ladies were alluding to?
Thanks, Sia. So yeah, so I wish I was there. I wish I could give everybody a group hug after that. It sort of feels I'm feeling a little stressed out. So we obviously have nothing to do with resilience per se. Just to position what we do at what BrandMapp is quickly for those people who don't know. We do a massive piece of research every year, and it's aimed at a specific piece of the pie of the South African population. So just to be absolutely clear, because often we see people saying, X% of South Africans, Y% of South Africans. we need to be a little bit careful about understanding who we're talking about. The work we do relates back to this pretty traumatic triangle anyway, as it is. So this is the income triangle of South Africa. There's about 40 million adults in this country, and about 70% of those adults, that's the bottom of the triangle, live in households earning under 10,000 Rand a month. That's what we call them the struggling masses. It's that's the reality of South Africa, a severely traumatized group of people. But there are a lot of surveys that concentrate on them. We kind of look at the other two pieces of the triangle. So if you take that 2.7 trillion Rand and you divide it up, about 25%, we call it the middle class, sit in those households earning between 10 and 40. And then at the top, you've got this tiny little group of 5% of all adults who live in top-end households. And the work we do is unashamedly, I'm afraid, in that top section of the triangle, mainly because that bottom 70% take home about 400 billion Rand a year. The middle class take home about 900 billion. And that top little section of the triangle take home 1.4 trillion, more than half of all the income in this country. So that's one of the reasons why I think we're quite stressed out and traumatized as a country, just to start with. You're looking at the Gini coefficient, welcome to the Gini coefficient. And the work that we've done for the last decade is really trying to understand this top piece of the pyramid. The only reason I'll say it's not more important or less important by any manner of means, but remember that what you're looking at there is 100% of the personal tax paid in this country. So we think that from a resilience point of view, if we want to have a robust, resilient economy, it's really important that we understand these people. How resilient are they as individuals and as workers in the workplace? Because companies are just groups of individuals. So we're this is what we focus on. Everything we do talks just about these 12 million people, just a disclaimer up front. So when Gabi and Pippa came to us, we were like, how do we try and help you quantify this whole process? What we did was we took their 10 R's of resilience and we worked with them, and we spent a really lot of time. I sort of back myself as a little bit of a wordsmith. I'm as a director of storytelling, I have made a living with my pen and paper and now a keyboard for quite a long time. So we spent a lot of time, Stuart and I and Gabs and Pippa, trying to work out how do we reduce these to statements that people can agree with or not agree with in a research format. And this is what we came up with. We came up with these 10 statements. What effectively they are 10 positives and negatives. We want to take out any positivity bias from the questionnaire. And the idea was, if we can just say to people, here are 10 statements, which ones do you agree with? Okay, and we can then get people to tick these statements, and we can try and turn that into some kind of a resilience measure. The way it worked was we had, if you like, 10 positive statements and 10 negative statements, and if you accept a positive statement, you get a +1. If you reject a negative statement, you get +1. So between the 5 statements, you have the opportunity, if you got all 5 positive attributes correct and all 5 negative, you'd score 10 points. Okay. It was a very simple mechanism to try and turn this concept of the 10 R's of resilience into some kind of measure that we could, so we can literally give you a point scale. Okay, so what happened? Well, whenever you go into field with these kind of things, you want to talk about trauma and resilience and anxiety. Going into field with these kind of things is always one of those moments because you're never quite sure what's going to happen. What you hope for as an analyst is that you don't just land up with 10 equal buckets. What you ideally are always looking for, that something that is statistically interesting, is the famous bell curve. So this would be something where when you're looking at human beings, you'd expect there to be a lot of people in the middle who are the average, and then fewer people on the edges, right? So your extremes you'd expect to be fewer. And we were just hoping that that would work. So fortunately, straight out of the research, this is what that resilience rating lands up looking like. So you can imagine we were pretty excited, didn't really know exactly what we had when it happened, but it was like, boom. When you see a shape like that, where you've got just exactly what you'd expect on a bell curve in the middle, you've got something that is statistically interesting. This is a normal distribution of data. So it means that there's a group of people in the middle who are more average, and you've got these people on the extremes. What it allowed us to do was create sort of super groups, right? Also, just so you know, those of you who's statistically minded out there, BrandMapp is not a small sample. We get 33,000 people responding to the survey. Okay, it is probably the largest piece of work done that tries to understand the middle class and up in this country. So the stats behind this are, you'd be brave to argue against it. Let's just put it that way. So when we create these super groups, we find this really cool kind of distribution, and we went, this is where it gets a bit normative. I looked at that and I was like, it looks to me like a 30, 40, 30 kind of breakup would give us 3 reasonable supergroups, so that we can, the simple thing is we would say the majority of people in South Africa majority of middle class in South Africans are average, about 30% would be slightly lower, and 8 to 10, 30% would be slightly higher. And that's kind of the model that we superimposed in order to tell some stories quite quickly. So the very first thing we did was we took those supergroups and overlaid them onto the measures that we already had. In other words, if we look at those 10 statements we come up with, what is it that's sitting behind different people scoring, sitting in these 3 different supergroups? So it's a bit of a blueprint for resilience. It looks kind of complicated, but at the same time, it doesn't look complicated at all. So effectively, the gray bars are the scores of people who end up being 8 to 10 in this 30% of higher resilience people. The red bars are people who are lower resilience. And what we can immediately start working out is what are the factors, what are the driving factors behind higher levels of resilience and lower levels? Okay, so what's creating this bell curve effectively? As a non, I'm not a life coach. I simply look at the data and I go, well, that's pretty obvious, right? The thing that will define you being a more highly resilient person is that people will come to you for support and advice. I suggest the opposite, hopefully, is not true, that if you're sitting there going, sheesh, resilient human being. That's where that 66 comes in. The primary driver
It seems like we're losing Brendan there. So just as he was getting into the meat of it, look, 33,000 people surveyed is no joke at all. But while we're trying to get him back into the conversation, I want to go back to Pippa and Gabi. From your perspective, just tying you back in as a partner from the Resilience Factory, do you want to jump in here on the blueprint of resilience?
Absolutely. So what was absolutely astounding, and Brandon's back, I see, so he can take over and share screen again, but what was incredible was to see exactly this. So Pippa and I have always known that the big differentiator, and Dr. Wentzel alluded to it, in South Africa, we're a tough culture, right? And part of that tough culture thing is we don't like to talk about our feelings and our emotions, but look at that. 66% of the low resilience people say, I don't like talking about my feelings and emotions. Oh my goodness, does that not underpin our model? Unless you can learn to process difficult emotion, you don't build resilience. It's vital capacity. And it's one of the things that popped up. Brandon, you're back.
No, I'm sorry. I think I just got rudely kicked out. That's like when a digital MC just kicked me out of my own conference. Weird.
But you're back.
Yes, cool. Over to you, Brandon.
Yeah, so I mean, I thought, when we look at data and when we see these kind of, that they seem to be incredibly simple stories, but man, I think those are powerful messages, So it feels like my instinct as an analyst when I look at this kind of thing is it worked, A, the model works, B, we've uncovered some really interesting things immediately, and then C, the obvious thing is like quite exciting for us, or as researchers and as people trying to understand society. It feels to me like we could lend, borrow, or allow this model to be played out in the bottom of that triangle as well. Wouldn't it be fascinating to see how this model plays out in the people in this country who really are struggling, So it feels like we've established something first time out the gates. We've got something and it makes quite a lot of sense. So the next level that we obviously go to is we can now take this data, we can run it, we can take the model and go like, what else do we know? So what other things can we state with certainty about resilient people? Well, BrandMapp is a pretty large piece of work. It starts getting into headspace and how you feel about life and your feeling, are you happy, sad, whatever, and all the way down to what shoes do you wear. So there's quite a lot of strange things that we can uncover. The starting point was simply, let's look at demographics and let's see if basic demographics tell us any stories. First thing was really interesting. So here's just males and females run against their resilience scores. Not much to speak of there. 1% shift here and there. It really doesn't tell much of a story. So gender, not really a significant factor at all. Interestingly, culture or ethnicity in middle class and up, absolutely, there's just nothing in that as well. So no correlation between ethnicity and higher levels of resilience. Very interestingly, with respect to what I just said about that triangle, is that I thought there would immediately be a strong correlation between household income and resilience, but actually it turns out not so much. So this very much is a personal measure. This is a more psychographic measure, obviously, than anything else. So household income, no, not so much. But we did find one place where there is an unequivocal correlation. So, and when I say correlation, the only reason I'm using it is because using that term specifically, we're still not sure a lot of the time about the cause and effect behind a lot of this work. It's a brand new piece of work. So it's hard to say whether the higher level of resilience is causing the behavior or whether the behavior is causing the higher level of resilience, if you know what I mean. We've got to be sure because causality does not always equal correlation. But when we see correlations, it almost doesn't matter. Identify the correlation, and then you can say that the one leads to the other for whatever reason. As time goes on, we'll unpack that. What is the correlation we found? Well, quite simply, the older you are, the higher your level of resilience is likely to be. So looked at whichever way you run the data, we see the same things. The lower resilient cohort, far more likely to be younger. The higher resilient cohorts, far more likely to be older. When we were running through this with Dr. Wentzel, he said to us, yeah, but okay, let's be sure this is an absolute. Are we sure there's a statistical, is there a statistical correspondence here? And the answer is yes. I've run all of what I'm about to show you in this slide and the next as a correspondence map, and there is a strong statistical correlation between not just these youth cohorts, but also what I'm about to show you. So bottom line, we've discovered what I think is a massively important insight, which we can put on the table and say, it is a simple fact that according to our model, which seems to have a good statistical pattern, shape, and validity, it is almost unequivocal that younger people are less resilient. I then took those age cohorts and ran them against some of all of the measures we're talking about. So these are my generational cohorts. The silent generation, that would be the over 65. Boomers, I think we all know what boomers are, Gen X, millennials. And then the incorrectly often called Generation Z, I think it's Generation Me, a generation born very much obsessed with themselves, which is great, but it has some problems, as this chart shows. So running those generations against just these four metrics, again, I am not a life coach and a specialist, but the story is pretty clear to me. When I see ski slopes like this, ski slopes being very strong charting that goes from low to high, this simply says that the younger you are, the less likely you are to enjoy talking about your feelings and emotions, the less likely you are to find it easy to recover when bad things happen, the more likely you are to feel a bit hopeless that life isn't worth living, and the more likely you are to not like being questioned about your beliefs. And the net result of all of that is that you're far less likely to be calm in a crisis. And these are self-aware people. They're actually ticking that box saying, I'm pretty, it's not, we didn't make them tick the box, they did. So my sort of final analysis of this would be, think of the implications of this for the workplace. If we need people to be calm in crises. We've just established that this turbulent world we live in is basically like a permanent crisis, and we need people to feel calm in that crisis. Younger people are going to find it increasingly difficult to do that without being given the tools. That's my amateur psychology statement.
Sorry, just a moment there.
Stop that, Sia.
Let me just talk about what I'm going through, because life, I don't know what you're talking about there, Brandon, about Generation Z. I have no idea.
I thought,
relate at all.
I thought you were going to say, I'm terribly sorry, we have to stop because I've got a yoga session to go to.
Excuse me, did you see my calendar for later this afternoon? Anyway, just as a parting shot before we start wrapping things up, we do have about 10-15 minutes left of today's presentation. I want to throw it back to the ladies at the Resilience Factory. Do you guys echo the sentiment as well? And let's get into some of the nuts and bolts of the actual report as well. Over to you, Gabi and Pippa.
Absolutely. So this is just so fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, Pips.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Brandon has said, you know, the story is in the ski slopes here. The most interesting piece I find of these questions is in the I don't like to talk about my feelings and emotions, because so often we think that the younger generation are talking as I am a Gen Xer just, but we talk about the younger generations who are very wrapped up in their feelings and their emotions. They may be wrapped up in them, but the really interesting thing is that the older you are, the more likely you feel more comfortable talking about it. And that was really surprising, actually. So yes, the younger people may be having far more complex feelings, emotions being caught in them, but they are struggling to talk. They're struggling to actually talk about them. But the fact is that we know that you know, we may assume that younger people are not highly resilient because they haven't got enough life experience. But what we know is that it is possible to learn the skills and the tools necessary to grow greater levels of resilience. And we've proved this through the work that we've done over the last 5 or 6 years.
Absolutely. And for me, it shows us there's this massive gap. The under 24s are desperately in need of these skills. I almost feel like it's our responsibility. We've got to find a way to take these skills to the youth, because, yeah, they're feeling a lot. But instead of processing the feelings and talking about the feelings and knowing how to do that, they're instead posting them. It's not the same as processing. Posting and processing, two very different things. We need to give the youth skills in order to not get stuck in anxiety, but to work it through, to lean in, to have the difficult conversations, because we know that that is what builds a capacity for authentic resilience. We also know that, obviously, because of that amazing age slide, that the older you get, the easier it is. And I think that's got a lot to do with emotional maturity. Yes, doesn't mean the skills can't be learned. They absolutely can be learned. And I think we have a responsibility to get this out there to the youth.
I thought you were also going to pick up on that little, I love the fact that there also seems to be a point where it's like, you know, well, I've retired now, and now I'm just so bored of talking about my feelings and emotions, just leave me alone, you know, I just want to watch TV, you know. So I like that little nudge up at the end. I think there's a mini story to be told about that as well.
There absolutely is. And so, yes, our resilience builds, and then it seems to tap off again over 65, and that's really intriguing.
Okay, well, note to self today: less posting, more processing. That's what I'm taking away from this. Brandon, I want to go back to you as we look at the report overall. What can we actually anticipate and expect from the report? What can we gain from it?
So what we're going to have in the report is pretty much what we've just heard, what you've just heard unpacked a little bit more. And then, obviously, as I said, we can run these measures. So imagine those super groups that I've just talked about, going into a little bit more behavioral kind of measurements. So what is the relationship, for example, between happiness and resilience? You know, can we show, we measure in the data, we ask simple question like, how happy are you? And we can take that measurement, correlate it with resilience, and go, is there a correlation, right? So it's a whole bunch of what I call correlation slides, which show you that resilient people tend to be certain things, or at least that there's a correlation between resilience and these factors. So education, relationships, successful relationships, longevity of marriages, their success in business, their place in businesses, how big their social groups are, what they're interested in, how active they are, how physically active they are, and then how will all of those things play out almost as consumers. So once we know these things about them, active people who are engaged, who, as in resilient people who are more active and more engaged, are almost more valuable consumers because they're doing more. So that's really it. We'll be unpacking that in I think it's maybe going to be 30 or 40 different slides, charts that are annotated in the report, together with everything we've been talking about, just a little bit more depth. And hopefully that'll be published probably in about 10 days or so. We'll be notifying everybody that it's out and available.
Fantastic. There are just two key questions from our audience that I want to highlight and throw forward to the panel to hopefully answer. The first is from Sash. And Sash would like to know, how do you convince those that are on the get on with it attitude about the value of working on authentic resilience? How do you deal and convince non-believers? Anyone on the panel would like to answer that?
Pippa, jump
Yeah,
in.
I'll just jump in there. Yeah, I mean, there are times, there's absolutely no doubt, there are times when we do just have to put our head down and get on with it. We all know we've been through those times. And I think the interesting thing is what we've seen over the last 20 months or so is the individuals, the companies who we've been working with, who at the beginning of the pandemic thought, that's cool, we're going to go into lockdown for 3 weeks, we're going to be able to get through this, we're going to do it. And they kind of lock themselves in with a suit of armor on and go into battle, and just put their head down. Yes, it's sustainable over the short term, but that is where increasingly over the months the burnout just happens, and you can see that happens. How do you convince people to do it? Sometimes, sadly, the only way is when in the hard evidence of where it doesn't work, where people hit the wall, and then they have to actually step back and do it. But what we love doing is to be able to come in earlier and to really show people the evidence of how we know that the most resilient people are the ones who have stopped, who have taken care of themselves along the way, and know the absolute importance of resting, restoring, renewing, and refueling along the way. Gab?
Just a little anecdotal story. We did a workshop about 3 years ago with a very tough group of all guys who, I think I must admit, they were giving us a hard time the whole way through the workshop. They were jeering each other, they were shouting comments, but in between, people were coming up when no one else was watching to say, this is really making sense to me. How do I do this? Give me the skills. But this culture was toxic. And yeah, it was one of the toughest workshops we've ever done. Blow me down, if not 18 months later, when they had a few deaths within their community, were we not the first people they made contact with to say, you know what? We don't know how to do this. Please come back. And this time we're listening. You got to learn the skills. Life is hard.
Well, goodness, talk about equipping and empowering yourself. Now I just want the resilience factory on speed dial at this point. We have another question that I want to throw forward to. Someone would like to know, is where you live a factor when it comes to resilience?
Absolutely not.
Sure.
See, I'll tell you, just from a data point of view, we didn't. It wasn't something we measured. In fact, well, if we measured it in the sense that we know where people live provincially, and we can dive down into like really sort of geo-specific. But it wasn't part of what we measured. I can only believe, though, I mean, Gabs, I'm sure will fill the gaps in that. You know, where you live we're all part of communities, and communities all live under different stresses. So as individuals living in different places, I'm sure, Gabs, you must have seen location or geolocation have a huge effect.
Well, it doesn't impact your authentic resilience levels. It might impact your experience of life, and it will definitely impact the challenges that you are facing. Does it impact your ability to be authentically resilient? No.
Yeah, great saying, which is wherever you go, there you are. So you take those resilience levels with you. We had a great piece of feedback recently, just this week. Somebody came on a workshop, an online workshop at the start of the pandemic, learning to learn the tools. And she said at the time, it's like, well, I'm moving country. I'm sure I'm going to need this. She emigrated, life turned into a terrible situation that she had no idea how bad things were going to be. And she just wrote to give us feedback to say, you know, it was like I went into war, but what you gave me with this was the tools, was the weapons to go into war, rather than going into battle with a wooden spoon. And she said, you know, she felt actually equipped. So these are transportable tools that, regardless of where you live, what situation you find yourself in. And the thing that we've really learned is that resilience is needed for not just those really tough times in life, you know, going through a divorce, going through a death, going through a loss, going through retrenchment. Resilience is often needed just for every day, just for going through the daily grind every day, for coming in month after month when you are a single mum struggling to make ends meet. That's where resilience is needed. It's in the everyday stuff. So the tools that we can teach are applicable across time zones, across genders, across age groups, etc. They really are applicable for everybody.
Incredible stuff. So just as we wrap up, I'd like to just go back to each and every one of our presenters this morning and get one final word or parting shot from each of you. If you could reach through your screen and leave our audience with just one thing to remember, what would it be? Let me start with you, Dr. John.
Thanks, Sia. I think the key thing coming out of this is the validation of what we know anecdotally. The evidence to back that up now confirms. The most important thing coming out of this is that we need to talk more about resilience, and we need to learn the tools. And if there's one takeaway, I think it would be that. Thank you, Sia.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. John. Gabi, what about you? Your final comments this morning?
I think that it's really important for leaders in every single community, business, school, medical, to understand you don't need to resilience your organization. You need to resilience your people. You need to help your people because they're under a lot of pressure. You've got to take the tools to your people. That's what's needed, and to the youth.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Pippa, what about you? What are your final comments this morning?
I think don't wait until you're in a crisis to build your resilience tools, your resilience toolkit. Think of it like a bank account that you want to save up for a rainy day. You want to make sure you've got padding in there. You want to make sure you've got what it takes before the tough times hit you. So, and those are skills that we can all start. It's a daily practice. We can start those daily practices absolutely today. Every single one of us can do that.
Great stuff. And Brandon, you'll have the final word.
The final word. Yeah, I think for me, I'm quite excited as an analyst. I'm excited actually to have started with something that is super theoretical and have this model that Pippa and Gabi have developed of the 10 R's and land up in a very, very data specific kind of cold hard world of data that validates it completely. And it starts, for me, it's a first step. It's like, I love the idea that we have started a journey where we've almost got a way of testing people. I don't think it's finished yet. You know, it's just the first stab. But it would be quite exciting to know that it's a little bit like testing you for immunity. You know, for whether you've got antivirals in your blood system for COVID. You know, wouldn't it be cool to just hand somebody an app and go like, test your resilience? And we are starting on that journey of actually putting a model together to measure levels of resilience that would be of use to corporates and individuals and everybody. I think that's quite exciting as an analyst.
It's a game changer, that's definitely for sure. Thank you guys so much for being part of this conversation. I've been learning so much and really, really awesome to pick your brains this morning. Thank you so much for just being here as well. This has been the Authentic Resilience Report for 2020. A big shout out to RedZone and Arena Events for putting this together, and as well a big shout out to BrandMapp and the Resilience Factory for making today happen. It's been absolutely incredible being with you. And thank you to all of our speakers for being with us this morning. Thank you so much. Dr. John Wentzel, CEO of Adcorp Group in Africa and Australia. Thank you so much to Brandon de Kock, Director of Storytelling, at BrandMapp. Thank you, Gabi Lowe, Director at the Resilience Factory. And thank you, lastly, but definitely not least, to you, Pippa Shaper, Director at the Resilience Factory as well. And definitely thank you, wherever you are watching, for being part of this conversation this morning, for watching, for engaging with us, for sending your questions and comments. We absolutely appreciate it. We hope you've enjoyed the insights and the results of this first ever in-depth study of authentic resilience. So just remember, wherever you are, let it be your new mantra today, that you are a human being, not human doing. And also, to all of my fellow Gen Zers, less posting, more processing. My name is Sia Sangweni. A pleasure to have been your MC today. Enjoy the rest of your day.